if you're interested in transforming challenges into opportunities to create value, then there's no better person to hear from than our next speaker, Paul Romer, who's going to talk about urbanization as an opportunity. Just very briefly, Paul Romer is an extraordinary individual. I've known Paul for 16 years, and I think the best compliment that I can give Paul Romer is in every year that I've known Paul, my opinion of him has risen. I think there are very few people over your lifetime who you can say that your opinion of them rises each year. Paul Romer started off life as an academic growth economist who recognized that the field of economic growth was dying, was dormant, took that as a challenge, and as Luke Williams told you yesterday, infused it with a theory about how innovation happens and how that drives economic growth, and changed, frankly, the face of modern economics. That's really an understatement. In the second phase of his career, Paul Romer was teaching MBAs at Stanford Business School and realized that when you want to teach very hard things that require a lot of technical material, that you need to engage people before they come to the classroom doing the nuts and bolts so that in the classroom you can just talk about the ideas. And so he started a company called Applia. Long before anybody had ever heard or thought about MOOCs or flipping the classroom, Paul Romer had figured this out and started and sold a company called Applia. And for the third phase of his career, Paul Romer is now at NYU at the Stern School of Business, helping people understand why cities, why urbanization is one of the biggest opportunities that business school students, not just urban planners, but business school students ought to be thinking about for the future. So without further ado, I give you my esteemed colleague and friend, Paul Romer.
So, as Peter suggested, I am just taken by the opportunity that we now face in our lifetimes, an opportunity that we can exploit through facilitating urbanization. It can be enormously beneficial, but because I'm sometimes misunderstood on this point, I think it's good to start by explaining that we have to steer urbanization in the right way. We can't just let any business that wants to lure young people into the city, make them live in accommodations where they have to share rooms, they don't have their own bathrooms, where the bosses just drive them mercilessly. Sometimes they have to work all night long to satisfy these bosses. And then they actually end up deep in debt after working at one of these organizations for 4 years. Of course, the organization I'm talking about is a university, like NYU, so we want to be careful not to let these kind of take over the city. But keep that story in mind, it's going to come back later. Let me describe one other story that's in the same, or kind of thought experiment that's in the same vein of trying to get you to think slightly differently about things that you take for granted. I tried this on a group of business people. Those of you who are business people can do this introspectively. For those of you who aren't, put yourself in the shoes of a typical business person. Imagine that you had two identical high school students. One is going to get 1 more year of high school education. The other randomly gets selected to go work for a year at Toyota in an auto assembly plant. Now, which worker would you want to hire after that year? The worker who'd spent the year at Toyota, or the worker who got 1 more year of education in high school? And if you're like most of the business people I try this on, they would pay more. They would rather have the student who went to Toyota, and then ask, would that student be willing to work for free at Toyota instead of working for free at the high school? Would that student pay tuition to have a year opportunity to work at Toyota? These are the issues that I want to close with after I explain what the connection is with urbanization. So a friend of mine, Ed Glazer, has a great book called Triumph of the City. And in it, Ed describes the most powerful ways that cities can change the world. Cities make us smarter, as Ed says. And that's I think that's almost right when you look around the developing world. But we need to just qualify it a little bit. Cities can make us smarter, but we need to think about what are the conditions that actually lead to that kind of outcome. Now, to explain why making us smarter is so important, I need to go back through a little bit of the history of economics and, frankly, distance myself a little bit from this first round of theory that I engaged in earlier in my career, on the growth theory that Peter alluded to. There's a way that we approach economic development or long-run growth based on theories of growth that goes like this. We say that the income for a nation is equal to what it produces, its output, and then we say that output is a function of the physical capital that a nation has, the human capital, and there is some attention in the theory to producing more human capital through schooling, for example. But the theory puts a lot of emphasis on productivity or technology, this kind of elusive, important driver of long-run progress. And so as a result, we have theories based on R&D policy or industrial policy that are all designed to somehow raise the value of this productivity variable. Now, what I want to suggest for thinking about most development experiences is that we should look at income the other way. National income is also equal to all of the payments to the factors of production, payments to the inputs, the resources. And the most important factor in any economy is the people. And so I'm going to describe different people with different kinds of skill or levels of skill, so H1, H2, H3. Those different types of people earn different wages, W1, W2. And national income is going to be the sum of all of those factor payments, plus some factor payments for other factors like raw materials or physical capital. But as I'll point out in a minute, it's the payments to people that are the most important. And if we think about it this way, these are just kind of accounting identities. But if we think about it this way, it can help us reshape our focus on policy in the direction of what I want to call factor policy. How could we think about strategies for growth that pay careful attention to how we can increase the income for all of these factors? Because ultimately, things like productivity, technology, only matter if they translate into higher income for people. Now, to just fill in this point about the importance of skills, people receive most of the income in an economy, 60, 70%, sometimes less, sometimes more. As you may be aware, this number is down in the United States, and we don't know if this is a temporary reduction or a sign of some kind of permanent trend, but it's still the vast majority of output or income in a nation. And so if you think about something that, say, would raise labor income by 10%, that could increase GDP, increase growth for the nation by something like 6 or 7%. You know, a huge amount compared to what we're familiar with in developed economies. And I want to try and persuade you that this is not an unreasonable kind of increase in labor income to expect if we create the right conditions in the cities, and if those lead to the right kinds of increases in skills. Now, one sign that there's things that we need to get right in developing countries is the evidence about what happens to the wage for a given worker when that worker moves from a place like Yemen to a place like the United States. What we see is that the typical migrant from Yemen earns 15 times more when they move to the United States. And that's after taking account of the fact that your money doesn't buy quite as much in the United States because the cost of living is higher. So this corrects for the kind of cost of living effects. If this worker sends the income home to people in Yemen, the purchasing power in Yemen is even greater, is larger by a factor that's even greater than 15 times. So there is something about the conditions in many economies that mean that the same worker earns less where they live than if they went someplace else. So this is a sign of a violation of something that economists believe should hold in a well-functioning market economy. Factor prices should equalize. The price for any factor, like a skilled human, should be the same in any market. And if we haven't achieved factor price equalization, we clearly haven't in much of the developing world, what we need to do is try and make domestic demand for those factors like the demand that they can face when they move to other parts of the world. We could also just encourage more people to move, but realistically, there's so much resistance to migration that we'll probably make more progress if we can change the demand in the developing world as opposed to letting them move to the demands that exist in places like the United States. Now, what is it that's different about demand in the United States compared to Yemen or any of the other countries on this list? Over time, economies go through a very predictable transition, what we call a structural transformation that involves a reduction in the fraction of employment that is accounted for by agriculture. So this is a range of countries where we have data over the last 2 centuries. If you can't read it, Belgium, Spain, Finland, France, Japan, so forth. As income grows, and I apologize, this is our fetish professionally, we love to play with logarithms. So income is measured on the horizontal axis here in logarithms. But the farther right you go, the bigger it is. So that's all you need to know. As income grows in a nation, a much smaller fraction of workers work in agriculture. As income grows, we also see an initial increase in manufacturing employment, but then an eventual decline. And as income grows, we see growth in the service sector, which proceeds at roughly one slope up into about the middle of the graph, and then it starts to take off even faster on the second portion of the graph, which is where people are working if they're leaving agriculture and they're leaving manufacturing. So this is the structural transformation. So in the United States, what someone who moves there from Yemen can face is a demand for factors that reflects this kind of transformation of the economy. Now, in a globalized world, there are ways to speed up this transformation that weren't available to relatively closed nations like the United States starting in 1800. One thing a developing country can do is attract complementary factors from other countries. If what you have is a lot of unskilled labor or inexperienced labor, a complementary factor that would raise the demand, make that unskilled labor more valuable, might be something like a skilled worker. And I'll give some more examples in a second. But in history, places like the United States had to develop their own skilled workers, their own designs to work with. But in the globalized economy, a developing country like Yemen could, in principle, attract the kinds of complements that could raise the demand for its low-skilled workers. You can pay for those complementary factors that are brought in by exporting to the rest of the world. But to do this, you need urban gateways. Those resources are not going to come in to the countryside in Yemen or the countryside in China. They're going to come into urban centers. So this is one place where urbanization starts to enter this discussion. Now let me just illustrate this with a story. So think about bicycle manufacturing in China. China made lots of bicycles up until sometime in I think it was in the 1980s or early 90s. They looked like 3-speed Raleigh bicycles copied from England in the 1950s. But then, starting with the opening up in China, you had these complementary factors that could come in and work with the workers who worked in bicycle manufacturing. Firms from Taiwan came in through Hong Kong, brought in gears that were made in Japan, brought in designs for mountain bikes that were developed in California, used marketing and publicity, marketing channels, retail links accumulated by these external firms, and became the biggest manufacturer and biggest exporter of bicycles in the world. Now, when that happens, what you see is in the cities where all these resources can come in, there's an increase in the demand for workers. That leads to a corresponding increase in the wages. But then what happens is you start to get migration of workers out of the rural areas into the cities. And if this operates fully, what you get is an equalization of the wages between the rural areas and the cities, but the cities end up with a lot more people. So there's still a real challenge in China about equalizing the rural-urban income differentials, but this is a sign that there just hasn't been enough opportunity for people to move from the rural areas into the cities, and this is a big focus for policy in China right now. Now, the canonical case of this, where this took place, the place where the reformers were able to show Chinese citizens, show Chinese workers how valuable it could be to let these complementary factors come in from the rest of the world, was in Shenzhen. In 1978, when there was a decision to create the special economic zones, of which Shenzhen was the largest and the one that was almost a greenfield. There was virtually nothing in Shenzhen when it was created as a special zone. From that time, it grew in a very short period of time up to a city of nearly 10 million people. And output in Shenzhen grew by a phenomenal amount. The growth there dwarfs anything you've heard about from Hong Kong or Shanghai. It's partly growth in people, but it's also growth in income per person. It's now has the highest income per person of any city in China. So it's just the perfect demonstration case of the value that can come from letting these foreign factors of production come in, letting them be matched with Chinese workers, and getting very rapid benefits from that. And the demonstration effect in Shenzhen meant that other cities in China all wanted to adopt this same kind of strategy. They all wanted to open up to direct foreign investment. They all wanted to export, and it led to a very successful transformation, complete transformation of the economy here in China. But we know that there's concern about cities, and that there's a sense that sophisticated observers have that sometimes urbanization does not turn out well. It's not for the reasons, not because of places like NYU, but there is something that can go wrong. This shows a pattern of urbanization, which is plotted on the vertical axis there. It's the percent of the population that lives in urban areas in a set of countries from Africa as a function of natural resource exports. And countries which have some income, not because they're producing agricultural goods, not because they're producing services, not because they're producing agricultural services, manufactured goods. It's because they're selling natural resources to the rest of the world. And what we see is that there is a pattern of people converging in urban areas to receive their share of some resource rents, and cities become essentially consuming cities. They're not places where people go to work. They're places where people go to get a share of the spoils and to consume. And I'll try and persuade you that this is not successful urbanization and give you a clear sense of why. Now, there is a question that's openly debated right now in China about whether the plans to further urbanize, there's a figure that's being kind of kicked around with some alarm in some quarters about another 250 million people moving into urban areas in China. This figure shows you, as of 2010, income, which for once, I think the only time in the whole talk it's not the log of income, it shows income on the horizontal axis and then this percentage of the population that lives in urban areas. And it shows you China's position in 2000, 2010, and its planned position for 2025. And it lets you compare this with other cities, other countries, like Japan, more than 90% urban, South Korea above 80%. But these worrisome cases that raise some of the same concerns that those African cities did from the previous graph. Places like Brazil and Mexico, where there's a sense that urbanization has not turned out well. Now, just estimating a kind of a rough curve that traces some trajectory here, it doesn't look, just to the eyeball test, as though China is urbanizing too rapidly relative to its income. It happens to have income, which is growing very fast. So it's both moving to the right and moving up very quickly, but not in any way which stands out as being disproportionate. But we still have to get a better sense of how would we know if China was following a path like Brazil or like these African countries I pointed to. And how would we know in the other case whether it's more like South Korea? So I'm back to log on the, and this is per capita income on the horizontal scale, the urban share on the vertical scale. And what this lets you do is trace over time the growth in income in China in the red line, and then the growth in the urban share. On the same axis, and this is the advantage of the log scale, you can see where the United States is, up with the blue line. And you can see Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, all which look like they're urbanizing fast compared to what China is doing, or fast, they're urbanizing faster than their income is growing. So it raises this concern that maybe there is something which isn't working right in those economies. And there's lots of kind of qualitative evidence that would reinforce this. But you can't understand this phenomenon by just focusing on urbanization and income. Because if you look at South Korea, for example, South Korea was a country which urbanized very quickly and very successfully. So it's not as though slow urbanization is always the best thing. And India is an example of a country right now which is urbanizing at a much slower rate than China, and arguably much too slow. So there's something more going on here than just a sense of you got to urbanize slow or fast or someplace in the middle. So what is that? By the way, this picture shows what the projection is for out to 2025. So another 250 million is not at all out of line with the recent pattern in China. Now let's go back to these pictures of the change, the structural change in an economy. If we try and look at data on agriculture for the time period for which this is available, you can see that China has got a falling share of employment in agriculture, as it should. Indonesia, which is just below China, it's falling a little bit faster. Turkey, Brazil falling faster. Brazil is a shorter interval, so it's not as though there was no growth in Brazil, but there's only 10 years of data there for Brazil. But Brazil kind of stands out as a place where, for its level of income, its share in agriculture was low. So it's consistent with the picture from the previous slide that it was also a place that urbanized quickly. If you look at this manufacturing curve and then try and plot the same countries on that curve, you see that China looks like it's on the upward slope of that manufacturing arc. The United States is clearly on the downslope. But a place like Indonesia and Brazil, which is this little bit here, I don't know if I can make the laser, yeah, that little bit right there is Brazil. Indonesia, Brazil, maybe not so much Turkey, but they look like they aren't employing people in manufacturing or in industry as rapidly as China, and I'll suggest that there is a real problem with that. And then the corresponding phenomenon is that Indonesia, Brazil, which is the little squiggly line there, it's got a high share of service sector employment for its level of income. Turkey has also got a rapidly rising service sector, so we need to understand whether this is a source of concern or not. Now, let's go back to this story about factor income. Let's think of two types of workers. So H1 means new factory workers, inexperienced workers, like the young women who move to Shenzhen and get jobs there. If you haven't read about this, there's a great book called Factory Girls that describes what it's like to move from a rural area and get a job in Shenzhen. So there's new workers, and then the more experienced factory workers. Part of what happens in an economy when you open up, you let those gears from Japan and those designs from California come in, and you employ these workers, is that wages for both types of workers can go up. But then what starts to happen is you convert the new factory workers into experienced factory workers. And so you get this accumulation of skill, not just increases in wages for fixed levels of skill. But what this should make us stop and think about is there may be some kinds of jobs that are better at inculcating skill, at transferring skill, giving people a chance to acquire new skills, just as there's some kinds of schools that do a better job of providing those kinds of skills. And we need to think about what kind of job is it that provides lifelong valuable skills. And this was part of the point of the initial story about Toyota. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that there's always this equilibrating process in the market that makes some of these things about acquiring skill might lead to widening income inequality. That doesn't have to be as worrisome as it sounds. Because think about what happens if you convert new workers who have lower wages into experienced workers who have higher wages. If you increase the supply of these experienced workers, the wage for those workers will go down, and the wage for the new workers goes up because there are fewer of them. So in a well-functioning economy like this, both the people who get skill and the most recent arrivals, or the people who are in jobs that aren't actually getting valuable experience on the job, they still benefit when other people do get that experience. So if things work the way it should, we don't have to be excessively concerned about income inequality during this process. So the things that are key here are attracting these complementary factors that raise wages in the beginning, raise wages to a level where people can afford to move into cities, to live in cities, and then to get jobs that offer them skill, that give them these lifelong learning opportunities. And so we should think about accumulating human capital, not just through good schools for young people, although that's important, but through these jobs that provide the kind of experience that make a good job, like a job at Toyota, that gives someone skills that can be more valuable even than the skills we get in high school. Or, heaven help us, maybe in college too. Now, we know that there's a huge difference in the quality of schools around the world. And this is clearest if you look at test measures of what students can actually do. Can they read? Can they do simple arithmetic problems? This test score index has a kind of an average of about 5, and one standard deviation. And one standard deviation is one unit. But mostly, you can think of it as just an index. So some of the best-known countries in the world do a very good job with their the ability of their students to pass these basic tests on reading and numeracy. These are the top performers in the world. Here's a kind of jumping down, a middle group, ranging from the UK through Norway, but it includes both China and the United States. And then if we jump down, finally, to the very bottom of the list, we have Mexico and Brazil, Indonesia, so that one way to think about the risks of too rapid urbanization is that if it comes in the context of people who don't have basic literacy and numeracy skills, they're gonna have trouble getting especially service sector jobs that can be ones that actually provide more skill for them. And on these grounds, it looks like China is in good shape. They have relatively good schools, so it's urbanizing along with relatively strong basic skills. So I think there's other grounds, on this basis, are grounds for thinking that the Mexico-Brazil kind of outcomes are less likely here in China. But I want to drill in on this point of why is experience so important compared to education? And this is something which we just don't pay enough attention to because we're always proselytizing about how important it is for a country to raise the quality of its educational system. Suppose the new graduates coming out of school are twice as skilled as the oldest workers in the population. So the school system's doing a very good job in the sense that these new graduates are just much more skilled than, say, the graduates of 50 years ago. And suppose each year about 1/50th of the labor force retires, and 1/50th is replaced by these new graduates. This is going to lead to an improvement in the average quality of the workforce of 1% per year. That's not going to get you 7% rates of growth of GDP. You know, that might get you 0.7%, but not 7%. So countries that have, for decades, have invested in education are going to be in a good position. But if you're the leader of a country and you've got to show some progress rapidly, education is a slow path. Now here's the thing that we don't pay nearly enough attention to, and it's part of why the United States does relatively well, even though our schools are not that good. What this shows is what happens to your wage, starting from a position of 0, at either people with high levels of schooling or low levels of schooling, and then what changes in your wage over the first 10 or so years of work in the United States. For the people with the least amount of schooling, they get about a 12% per year increase in their wages for these first 10 years. Incredible increases in their skill as reflected in their wages because of their time on the job. And notice that it's stronger for the people who didn't get skill in school. There's something about the right kind of work environments that it can provide valuable skills that some kids get from school, but those who don't have another chance to get it through on-the-job experience. Now, the United States is different from many other countries because this learning curve rises much faster, this experience curve. What happens to your wages is a function of how long you've been on the job. Your wages rise much faster in the United States, a little faster than Germany. China actually does relatively well by this measure. The final points where it declines are probably an artifact about the way the data was constructed. Brazil is substantially lower. India and Mexico even lower still. So we shouldn't think about a job as being a job as a job. There are clearly some work environments and some labor market conditions that make a job a much better learning environment in some places than others. And the thing that could offer the biggest gains in places like Brazil, India, Mexico, even bigger gains, if China fully utilized them, would be making their employment opportunities and their job markets more like the job market in the United States. Make jobs a driver of lifelong learning. And then if you think about what goes in the service sector, the service sector here is this kind of mishmash of jobs like people in a call center, people doing coding, people doing accountancy services, but also people who are the street vendors selling fruit from a cart. And the people selling the fruit from the cart are probably not going to learn as much on the job as somebody who's exposed to better educated managers, who's picking up modern management techniques, working with modern technology. And that could be for people with the lowest levels of skill in a factory job. The factory job is still the place with very little skill where someone can go and learn powerfully important skills like punctuality, teamwork, ability to work with a supervisor, a little bit of attention to an absolute quality threshold that you have to meet. These are the basics that can make someone a much better worker, a much more valuable worker, and that factory jobs can convey. There are service sector jobs that also teach valuable skills, but those service sector jobs are generally available only to people who have relatively high levels of schooling. So a country that has a weak school system and which doesn't develop its manufacturing sector is creating traps in the jobs for its workers. It's not creating good jobs. It's feeding people into service sector jobs that will deprive them of this chance for lifelong learning. So, to conclude, factor policy means increasing the demand for the factors you have. Take the kinds of workers you've got. If they're less skilled, the thing that will increase the demand for those workers is probably manufacturing. It's probably things that people would dismiss as sweatshop jobs, the kind of jobs that the factory girls got when they went to Shenzhen. But if you can increase the demand for people who have low skills and get them into jobs that provide skills, then they can all improve their productivity, their human capital, and this can have a big effect on wages. 10% per year is not inconceivable, just like in the United States, and effects on national income of 6 or 7% per year are also feasible. So we need to think about increasing the demand for the factors you have as being the essential part of developing the kinds of factors that you want to have. So to conclude, cities can make us smarter, but they do it only if we use them as the chance to create lifelong learning opportunities for everyone. And that is the opportunity that urbanization presents for us. But it isn't something that will happen automatically. It will take good policy to make it happen. And it'll be a remarkable few decades to watch as China, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia struggle, sometimes take advantage with this opportunity. Thanks. So I've mismanaged the time, so there is actually time for questions. So I'll be brave and take any questions. I think there are microphones.
What are your thoughts? Recently there's been talk about how China should spread out and encourage growth in smaller cities. And some people have given commentary to the fact that actually Shanghai and Beijing should get even bigger. That would encourage a mass of more people and more growth within massive urban centers rather than smaller urban centers. Yeah.
China's biggest cities are not that large compared to the biggest cities around the world. And so there's an a priori kind of view which says that there should be room for the biggest cities to expand. And I think on many dimensions of urbanization, we need to take the kind of stance that we take about many factors about the economy, which is create systems which can respond to whatever the new value is in the economy. And if the value is to have growth in a city like New York right now, everybody wants to move to New York. Rents are going up. You know, the best thing you can do as a policymaker is accommodate that. Try and create more space for people to move into New York if that's what the demand is for. So I think a good strategy here in China would be to support urbanization generally, to let people move into urban areas, but make it responsive to the market. See where the demand is highest. Where the demand is highest, there should be the biggest profit opportunities to build new urban development. And the thing that I think could do the most to encourage this here in China would be to finally let go of this legacy of the hukou system and allow free mobility amongst the different cities of China, and then let these cities compete with each other. And some of them may try, build it and they'll come, and those cities might succeed or they might not. But that kind of competition between the many cities of China, I think, would be healthy.
Thank you, Professor. It's very enlightening explaining the economic drive behind the urbanization. I'm curious your view about other factors, such as cultural, political, because I was struck by a piece a couple of weeks ago by David Brooks. Yeah. He essentially talked about, you mentioned people moving back to New York City from suburbs. In fact, that's a nationwide trend. Right. According to him, it's due to, the family demographic shift. Yeah. 5-10 years ago, family was headed mostly by husband and wife, but now, 4 out of 5. Yeah. But now it's just opposite. Right. Only 1 in 5. Right. And because of single parents or same-sex marriage, and that drive people back to the city because that would be a more attractive environment to raise family. Yeah. What's your view on that?
So I think one thing that's helpful is to remember that there's some people who are going to see a glass half full and some see it half empty. And in a more differentiated way, if you're somebody who's very worried about the family, then you're going to see every development as a sign of something that's going on with the family. But there might be many other things going on. There's a sign, I'm told, at railroad crossings in France that says, be careful, one trade may hide another. So there may be something else which is going on. I think that the single biggest factor changing the demand for urban lifestyle in the United States is the reduction in crime. And it's a matter of some debate why crime is down so much. It has just transformed life in New York City and makes NYU a radically more attractive place to a neighborhood to live in and a place to work. There is an argument that says something like, well, crime is one of these things driven by culture. We don't know what changes culture, but somehow it just got better. I think there's another argument which says that cities have actually learned how to manage their police forces and get police to do more of the thing that actually reduces crime compared to things that we know don't reduce crime. So a management innovation in police departments across the United States may be responsible for this huge improvement in the quality of life, but now a readjustment of suburban residents as opposed to urban residents and employment. So I wouldn't focus just on this family dynamic in looking at that. More generally, there's two views that are at the extremes that I think can lead us astray. One is that culture determines everything and you can never change it. So it's a cultural determinism and it's just something over which we have no control. Economists who sense that that's wrong have traditionally said, well, there's no such thing as culture. So, they'll tell stories like, oh yeah, everybody said the culture in South Korea was a disaster. South Korea's going to be a basket case. Look how wrong they were, so obviously there's no such thing as culture. I think that's wrong as well. I think there is a thing that you can identify as culture or the norms about right and wrong in a population. But where the cultural determinists go wrong is they don't understand that culture and norms can change. And I think one of the biggest challenges in executing good policy is paying attention to how do we change norms that might have been appropriate for a different era, but aren't appropriate for the current era. And I think one just fascinating example was the use of Shenzhen as a kind of a pilot demonstration in China that working for those running dog capitalists might actually be a useful thing because it might make us smarter instead of something that we have to resist on ideological grounds. And I think the strategy that they used here in China, which was to create a place where if you wanted to try working for those foreign firms, you were free to go there, but in the rest of the country, nobody was forced to live in that kind of environment. So this new policy was available only to people who wanted to try it out. And then when it proved successful, the rest of China wanted to copy it. So this is a really profound change in norms about is it right to work at a factory or work at a company where the company can just fire you? To many people, it sounded like an awful system, just morally wrong. But then you get some experience with it, and you find out that you can get fired, but you can also quit. And so you read this story of the factory girls. A lot of them, they don't get fired. They quit from these jobs because their skills go up so quickly, they can earn much more when they quit and go someplace else. So I think the Chinese case is a fascinating example of how a thoughtful policy led to a change in norms that has served China very well. And the challenge now is to look at the other kinds of norms about following rules, about pollution, about honesty, about sticking to contracts. There's lots of norms that need to evolve in China, but there's lots of norms all over the world that need to evolve. And this is where urban policy gets, I think, very interesting beyond just this question of providing opportunity. But even here, norms matter. It may be good to have a norm that says, in this place, you do not have the right to be unemployed. everybody has to be working, because you got to be contributing. You got to be accumulating some skill. And if you're not in school and accumulating skill, then you got to be working. You can't just be unemployed and wait for your dream job. That's a different kind of norm than we're used to. Another norm is it might actually be good to have jobs where a firm can fire a worker who doesn't show up on time. Because the way you learn punctuality sometimes is you get fired from your first job because you aren't punctual, and then you learn this is serious, and then in your next job, you are punctual. And things that are clearly well-intentioned to protect people from risk could actually have the negative consequence of undermining the learning opportunity. So it's a good thing at NYU that we don't have, a union contract that means we have to give A's to every student, because, it might not be as good a learning environment. Okay. So there's a gentleman here and then a woman towards the back.
You talk about abolishing or phasing out the hukou system.
Yeah.
I think eventually that's what needs to be done. At the same time, I think the argument against like a Big Bang approach is that it will put a tremendous strain on the current system, infrastructure, education, healthcare, whatnot.
Yeah.
Do you think, or in your research, is there an optimal roadmap or timetable to do that?
I think there's a lot of agreement on the things that would have to be adjusted along with the change in hukou. And then reasonable people can differ about what's the right pace at which to do this. I think there's an argument to be made for accelerating the pace, and I think there's some discussion about this. And what it may require is some readjustment of the fiscal system so that a city that, for example, attracts a large number of workers could welcome their families along with them and provide the education for their children, provide the health care, because that city gets tax revenue from the in-migration of those workers and from the jobs that they work in. So as long as the fiscal system provides the resources in proportion to the new service demands that the city faces, I think that this can operate in that same kind of decentralized fashion I was talking about before, where cities are all competing with each other. But in a really competitive environment, part of how cities will compete is by offering benefits where you can bring your family and a chance for your kids to get a good education. So nothing could be more, I think, more progressive or more helpful for the most disadvantaged in China to have this just cutthroat competition break out between all the cities that are all trying to get big because they believe, as the first question suggested, that there may be some inherent advantages in scale, in large scale, and that there'll be this rush to be the places that get big and survive. I don't know the institutional constraints well enough here in China to give an informed answer to that. But in general, just as people underestimate the potential for, say, change in norms, they underestimate the potential for rapid technological progress when there's an incentive for that progress to take place. I think they usually underestimate the potential for change in social arrangements if there are incentives that reward people for making those changes. So if you put me in the room with the same evidence with all the other people and we all looked at it, I'm going to be out in the tail that says, oh, we could go a lot faster.
My question about definitely we all agree that urbanization is one of the drivers, but there's always another comment. Can you hear me?
No, start your question again.
Urbanization is one of the drivers that is for sure, but there's another comment that's saying that China is the only country that is experiencing both urbanization and aging. And aging could be like negative factor, which means that the manufacturers may not have like enough labor, and also the people who are aging may not want to live in the metropolitans. They want to live in some like second tier or third tier cities that does not require that much like traffic or other burdens. So will that change your conclusion a little bit, and what the factors that you will add into your research about the future of China?
Yeah, so this is in some ways like the question about the advantages of bigger cities relative to smaller cities. If we have relatively free mobility and free competition between cities, we'll see what will happen. Some people have argued, and I'm now persuaded by this, that aging is actually going to increase the demand for city life. I've got 2 parents that won't be able to, and it's going to drive the demand not just for urbanization, but dense urbanization that supports effective public transportation. I have 2 parents that I grew up in Denver. In Denver, it's almost impossible to do anything without a car. And when they get to the point that they can't drive, their quality of life is going to be just drastically reduced in Denver. If they lived in New York City, they wouldn't even notice when they couldn't drive anymore. You can get delivery of everything. You can get a cab. You can go ride the subway. So I actually, because I was so focused on young people and employment, I actually used to share your view on this. But somebody from Japan actually persuaded me that aging is going to increase the demand for urban life, especially the kind of very dense Manhattan-style life or Tokyo-style life that supports public transit. And having now lived in New York City, I'm persuaded. I actually just sold my car. So. And NYU gives me a free parking space, and I still sold my car. So. One final question?
Paul, what's the downside on, well, just to go back to the older parents, right? You know, I guess the option is the assisted living centers that may not be in urban cities, but still will take care of that problem. So I'm not 100% sure that urbanization is a solution to old age. But leaving that aside for a second, what's the emotional impact on people urbanizing more and more?
Yeah.
Is there a positive, a negative?
Yeah. Well, so
happiness fact?
Yeah, I'll make a confession, which is that when I was at Stanford, I decided urbanization, this is the way to solve the world's problems. So I got to go out and sell urbanization. But man, I don't want to live in a city. It's like I wasn't really willing to, walk the walk. But then I moved to NYU because NYU said, we'll give you a chance to really go for this, the importance of urbanization. And then I lived so I viewed, instead of thinking of New York as a bonus, this was like, oh man, I can't bike, I don't have the outdoors, And then I get to Greenwich Village and the New York campus, and I just loved it, much more than I anticipated. So I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question, but I guess it is a reminder about the answer to several of these questions where I said, we don't know the answer to a lot of these questions. Even at the personal level, we often fail to anticipate how we're going to react. So you have to have policy that steers generally in the right direction. Like, we got to create opportunity for learning over people's careers. But then beyond that, we need the system that can be responsive to demands. And if it turns out that lots of people want to live in cities, the cities will expand. If they'd rather live in kind of semi-rural areas and the assisted living centers, we should have a system that accommodates that as well. I personally am betting that a lot of people are going to have the same reaction that I've had to dense urban life, which is that it's just invigorating, it's stimulating, it's such a relief to be free of a car. I think a lot of people are going to find that attractive. But we're going to get another data point, because I'm going to come teach here at NYU Shanghai in the fall. So I'll test and see, do I like all cities or do I just like Greenwich Village? So ask me at next year's meeting. Thanks.